Greetings. In this mini lecture, I want to get back to that concept of power and link power in governments and just give you some terminology that is often used when we talk about governments and power. And one of them is this term legitimacy. Legitimacy. So this is the mass feeling that the government's rule is rightful. Now, don't misunderstand that. That does not mean that people believe that the government is good or that the leader is good, right? You can believe that the president has the right to rule, but you may not think the president is very good. And I want to illustrate this with the American Revolutionary period. As you know, after the 7 Years' War, there was a dispute between the colonists and King George III of Britain. And King George wanted to change the rules of the game and impose taxation. And you may remember in 1201 various taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, a variety of them. And the result of that and other British activity was a lot of pamphleteers began speaking out against King George and calling George a bad king, and eventually a rebellion broke out. It was a rebellion. British citizens, right? The colonists were part of the British Empire, who were mad at their government. But for a long time, the claim was not that King George doesn't have the right to rule us. The claim was that King George is a bad king. And then comes Thomas Paine, and I would star this. Thomas Paine's document, Common Sense, went beyond anything that had occurred up to that point. Up until Thomas Paine's pamphlet in early 1776, right? Up until January of 1776, when Paine's document came out, the pamphleteers were talking about King George as a bad king. And now along comes Common Sense. And in this particular case, in Common Sense, Thomas Paine doesn't say that King George, he is a bad king for the reasons that have been discussed, and Thomas Paine even added on to that. But what makes Common Sense so powerful, and the reason it is so important, is because for the first time we have King George III's legitimacy seriously questioned. Paine doesn't just say that King George is a bad king. Thomas Paine says, I do not believe that King George III has a right to govern us. And this spread throughout the colonies. And within 6 months of the publication of Common Sense, you have Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. And for the first time in the history of the world, a colony separates itself from her mother country. In my mind, Common Sense is a prerequisite to the Declaration of Independence. If there isn't a document called Common Sense, or a document that is very similar to Common Sense, we may not have had a Declaration of Independence for quite some time. I also mentioned in the notes that if you look at Scandinavian countries, there are very few police officers in Scandinavia. And the question is, well, why is that? Some political scientists have made the claim that there is a very low crime rate in Scandinavian countries. There's very few police in Scandinavia. And one of the major reasons that there are very few police in Scandinavia is because the government in Scandinavian countries, whether we're talking about Sweden or Finland or Denmark, Norway, whatever country we're talking about, in those countries there is strong legitimacy. The people have tremendous respect for government. and the rule of law, and it's very powerful. Let me let me tell you a story. When I was in college, my best friend at the time, we hung out together all the time. We were like brothers. He was almost 10 years older than me, but we formed a very close bond. He was from Iran, and in this particular case, he had grown up in a very wealthy family. His dad had been an oil man, was involved in a joint venture with the British. And then there was a revolution that overthrew the Shah of Iran and brought to power the religious clerics led by Ayatollah Khomeini. And I asked my friend, his nickname was Mo. He had a much longer name, but I just called him Mo. I go, Mo, isn't this a great tragedy? Because under the Shah, your family did quite well. And Mo surprised me with what he said. He said, Richie, he called me Richie. Richie, my dad knew the Shah of Iran. My dad was very wealthy dealing with the Shah. But people in Iran did not believe the Shah of Iran was legitimate. We had an election in the early 1950s. The people of Iran, in a democratic election, elected a socialist. His name was Mossadegh to be the leader of the country. The CIA staged a coup and overthrew Mossadegh and put the Shah of Iran on the throne. He said, even my father, who did very, very well under the Shah, did not believe that the Shah was really our legitimate Iranian leader. My dad used to call the Shah an American puppet. The Shah is a representative of America, not of our country. He said, my dad liked the Shah, thought he was a good man, and actually thought that he wanted what was best for Iran, but the Shah was doomed. If it hadn't been for the United States backing his regime up with a lot of political power, the regime would have failed. And of course, it eventually did. So when you're talking about legitimacy, you're talking about, I believe that that person has the right to rule. The person may be a good leader, it may be a bad leader. We're not talking about that. We're talking about whether or not that individual has the right to rule. The second concept that's listed is sovereignty. And sovereignty is the power of the government to rule over its territory. So we're talking about both internal and external sovereignty. And what I mean by internal sovereignty is that that country has control over its own territory. If any of you took my global politics course, and I probably should look at the roster to see, but one of the things I do in uh, my global politics course, and I've mentioned it earlier, is I believe that countries go through 5 crises to stability. And one of them is what I call the crisis of penetration. And what that means is, are laws enforced? Do the people obey the laws? Or if you go out to rural areas or you move away from the capital, does the power over the government disappear? I remember listening to a news story, it was several years ago, I forgot how many, but the newscaster was talking about this essentially civil war situation in the country of Yemen. And the reporter was saying that the government really only had firm control over about 6 square blocks from the capital outwards. In other words, it only had clear authority and clear sovereignty over this very, very small territory. And essentially, every mile you got away from the capital, the less power and authority the government had over its own territory. Now, this even occurs in advanced countries. For example, the U.S. Supreme Court made a decision in 1954 called Brown versus the Board of Education. And the U.S. Supreme Court said that schools, public schools, had to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. So southern states, it's time to integrate. Well, some states obeyed the court order, like Delaware and Washington, D.C., for example, and Kansas. But South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, those states gave a collective middle finger to the national government and refused to implement it. So in this case, the law had changed and the courts had made a court order, but in that particular case, the Supreme Court did not have the ability to impose or enforce its rule over all of its territory. The third one is authority. This is the psychological ability of leaders to get others to obey them. And certainly this is tied to legitimacy. But it's on a more personal level. So if I talk about Franklin Roosevelt is perceived as having a lot of authority, or Abraham Lincoln had a lot of authority. It's kind of, in a sense, legitimacy at the individual level, the ability to get people to obey them. Now, I want to mention two other words that I want you to write down. I didn't put them here. It really doesn't belong here, but I think it's an oversight in the first chapter of your book. Often there are two words used, nations and states. And so when I use the term nation, it's really a group of people. A group of people who are psychologically tied together. They may have a common language, they may have a common history, they may have a common religion. There is something that ties these people psychologically to one another. A state is the institutional or governmental element of the country that has sovereignty. So states have people, states have geographical boundaries, states have sovereignty, right? You have a government and sovereignty. And you have groups of people, nations, that don't have fully formed states, like the Palestinians, for example, or you often hear about the Kurds, for example, in the Middle East, right? They are a nation. They are a group of people who are psychologically tied to one another. For centuries, we had a nation. We'll call them the Jews. The Jews were a nation, but the Jews did not have a state that was theirs until the creation of Israel. And of course, Israel is actually a multi-ethnic state and multiple religions, but you get the idea of the difference between a nation and a state. For many years, there were groups of people who considered themselves Germanic, and yet Germany did not exist as an independent country until after the Franco-Prussian War. There were people for centuries who perceived themselves as Italian, and yet for centuries, Italy was a collection of city-states that weren't unified at all. Again, not until the 19th century. So you should know legitimacy, you should know sovereignty, you should know authority, and I would just add in the margins the notions of nations and states. In the next mini lecture, which will be my last mini lecture on chapter 1, I'm going to talk about, well, why do people want power? I've talked about power, I've talked about its dimensions, I've talked about governments and power. But the obvious question is, well, why do people want power? There is a biblical quote that says, what good is it, right, if man conquers the world if he gives up his soul? Well, that would be the notion of the ancient Greeks as well. We're going to talk about things that might motivate people to power, and then a few loose ends on theories, hypotheses, and other concepts. So one more mini lecture to go, and we will be concluding chapter 1.